Hello everyone, welcome to this video discussion. So in this video, I shall be talking about the role of discourse analysis in understanding narratives. One of the interesting facts about discourse analysis is that it covers the analysis of different kinds of texts. And one of the interesting texts as well being analyzed in the field of discourse analysis is the narrative. So, narrative has been one of the major themes in humanistic and social scientific thought since the mid 20th century. Now, what's good about gathering narratives is that narratives contain not only the ideas but also the emotions of people. So, when people tell stories or when people narrate experiences, narrative captures the entirety of these ideas, experiences, and even emotions. So in linguistics, narrative was one of the first discourse genres to be analyzed, and it has continued to be among the most intensively studied. That is why if you want to analyze the experiences of a person or of a group of people, the narrative could really help in getting the thoughts, ideas very well, and as well as digesting or extracting as well the emotions that are found or concealed behind these words. So there are different approaches that we can use in the analysis of narratives. The first approach is the structural approach. Russian Vladimir Prop's in 1968 fundamental claim, originally proposed in the 1920s, is that all folk tales have the same deep structure sequence of functions or meaningful actions by characters. So whatever the literary genre is, Props here suggests that a literary text, most especially a folktale or a narrative in nature, contains specific functions. And every action in that narrative or in that literary text is or has a specific function as well. So that actions there are really meaningful enough to draw out the emotions or the thoughts and ideas of the characters involved. French anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss claimed that traditional narrative around the world through superficially varied all deals with a limited number of basic themes. So whatever the nature of the narrative is, as long as it is a narrative, it contains basic themes. And these basic themes could also point out to the different ideologies, emotions, or thoughts and ideas that are present in the words of those people or characters involved. Several French philosophers and literary theorists adopted Props and Levi-Strauss's ideas to the analysis of literary narrative. The context of structural approach, specifically here in the approach proposed by Prop and Levi-Strauss, is literary in nature. We also have narratives which are non-fictional. For example, when you conduct a research and then you interview people, so the interview transcript there may serve as a narrative which you can also analyze using discourse analysis. Literary texts that are narrative in nature could also be approached structurally. That's according to the proposition of Vladimir Prop and Levi Strauss. So the two common assumptions of the two are, first one, there are abstract levels on which structures and meanings that seem different superficially are really the same. So at some point, these different themes, these different ideologies found in the narratives actually connote different abstract levels of structures. And this is actually why we get to perceive literary narratives in different perspectives. They actually contain different meanings. Narrative analysts should distinguish between the story as a series of events and the story as told by the author. Because if we have different points of view for this one, we can actually realize that when a story is just a series of events, it's just purely plot. Okay, you look at the climactic arrangement of the plot, you look at the series of events or experiences happening in the narratives. But it becomes a totally different story when you are talking about narratives as told by the author. Because these narratives have become more powerful considering that they're told by the author, and so emotions and more ideas are being injected to it. So these are the two common assumptions under the structural approach to narrative. In narrative analysis, oral versions of personal experience, Labov and Waletsky proposed a formal approach to personal experience narrative. So it's going to be a totally different story when you are analyzing personal experience narratives already. So the goal was to describe the invariable semantic deep structure of personal experience narratives with an eye to correlating surface differences with social characteristics of narrators. So whoever narrates or whoever shares a story in the narrative should also be checked based on his or her social characteristics. What kind of character or what kind of persona does that person have in the context of, for example, society or culture? So it's also very important that you know the social background of the narrator or the person telling the narrative. According to Nabov and Waletsky, a clause in a personal experience narrative can serve one of two functions. First one, it could be referential. Second one, it could be evaluative. Now, it's very important that clauses in narratives are also studied this way. Since we are dealing about discourse analysis, it's very important that you know the functionality of each clause found in the narrative. Okay? Because that is how we shall look at discourses. We look at them not only in terms of the lexical items or other linguistic features, we also look at the structure, the syntactical structure. And usually, these structures may signal that it's referential or evaluative in nature. So when we talk about referential clauses, they have to do with what the story is about. So these are the clauses that tell us about events, the characters, the setting. Okay. So for example, if there are certain elements or if there are certain syntactical structures there in the narrative which tells about specific events in the story or which introduces characters or which brings you to another setting, then that is a referential clause. On one hand, evaluative clauses have to do with why the narrator is telling the story and why the audience should listen to it. It actually highlights the point of the story. So this may have something to do with the theme of the story as well, or it could be the moral of the story because it tells us about what to evaluate in the context of the narrative. So if it's referential from the word itself, it refers or points back to the certain elements. For example, events, characters, settings, like that. But when we talk about evaluative, we look at the literary text, the narrative holistically. That's why you need to understand the meaning of the entire text as well, so that you will be able to understand the real purpose. Okay, why the audience should listen or should read the story. Any narrative includes at least two narrative clauses. A narrative clause is a clause that cannot be moved without changing the order in which events must be taken to have occurred. For example, I kicked this boy and he kicked me. Okay, so that's the first set of expressions. This boy kicked me and I kicked him. So when you move certain elements or parts of the narrative clause, then definitely the whole story changes. So you can also look in discourse analysis of narratives. You can also look at these narrative clauses. What are the common or dominant narrative clauses? Or you might want also to check on the different referential or evaluative clauses used. And which between the two do you think is the most dominant in a literary text by nature is a narrative? Okay, for Labov in 1972, a narrative is not any talk about the past nor any talk about events. It is specifically talk in which a sequence of clauses is matched to a sequence of events, which it is inferred actually occurred. So in this case, narrative goes beyond the series of events in the story. Okay, this may also point out to the sequence of clauses which is matched to a sequence of events. So how parallel the clauses chosen are with the sequence of events portrayed in the narrative or in the story. A fully developed narrative may include clauses or sets of clauses with a number of functions. As what I mentioned, we have referential, we also have evaluative clauses, and we also have narrative clauses. Now, the abstract consists of a clause or two at the beginning of a narrative summarizing the story to come. It announces that the narrator has a story to tell and makes a claim to the right to tell it. So usually this is the first or the beginning clause of a story. For example, once upon a time. So that portion of the story is called a clause with an abstract, okay, with a function, or it functions as an abstract, a clause that functions as an abstract in the entire narrative. And then you also have the orientation. So this one in a narrative introduces characters, temporal and physical setting, and situation. So if there are clauses there which tell us more about the character, or which tells us more about the time, the atmosphere, the setting, or even the situation or the condition in the narrative, then that is orientation. It often occurs near the beginning, but may be interjected at other points when needed, most especially if there are portions or moments when you need to introduce a new character. So definitely the clause with this kind of function has to be present. We also have complicating action, which are clauses that are narrative in nature, and they recapitulate a sequence of events leading up to their climax, the point at which the suspense is resolved. These clauses refer to events in the world of the story and in the world of the telling. They create a tension that keeps the audience listening. So usually the complicating action is a clause which actually contains the start of the climax, okay, or the start of the conflict. And then we also have the result or resolution, which releases the tension and tells what finally happened. So in a literary text, which is a narrative, it is usually found at the end or conclusion part of the narrative. Often just before the resolution, but also throughout the narrative, are elements that serve as evaluation, stating and underscoring what is interesting or unusual about the story and why the audience should keep listening and allow the teller to keep talking. For example, expressions like "it was the strangest feeling" or "I said, oh my God, here it is." So these are evaluation clauses because they also portray certain emotions. Okay? So as stated here, evaluation has the goal of stating or underscoring what is interesting or unusual about the story. For example, when you say "it was the strangest feeling," meaning it suggests that there is something strange about the story, or there is something strange with the climactic arrangement of the plot. Or when you say "I said, oh my God, here it is." So the shocking nature or the shocking emotion reflected or concealed in this expression will definitely tell us that there's something odd. Okay? There's something totally unexpected which happened in the story. At the end of the story, the teller may announce via a coda that the story is over, sometimes providing a short summary of it or connecting the world of the story with the present. Usually, this is the last portion of a narrative. Apart from structural approach, we also have interactional approach, because when you look at structural approach, then you will have to look at narratives as a certain structure. So you study the structure, the clauses, the wording, the choice of words. In interactional approach, it's going to be a totally different approach. Research in this kind of framework examines how the structure of stories reflects the fact that stories perform social actions and how audiences are involved. So that means the specific flow of different events or experiences in the story will also tell the different social actions being represented. So everyday and conversational stories usually need to be introduced, closed, and generally tailored to the context of talk and its participants. Thus, it is imperative to have conversational work. So that's why there are dialogues within the narratives. Another point to which conversation analysts have drawn attention is the pivotal role of participation frameworks in the design, management, and reception of stories. So are there any turn taking of stories in the literary, or is it just unisided? Interactionally oriented narrative analyses have also pointed to the reductive nature of models of storytelling that focus exclusively on monologic narratives told in interview context without considering the richness and complexity of narrative genres and of telling formats both in everyday and institutional context. Now, this primarily suggests that there is this reductive nature of models used in interactional approach, wherein storytelling is used in, depending on the interview contexts, and sometimes, richness and complexity of these narrative genres are not really that considered. So many studies have also looked at how narratives contribute to the construction of gender identities. You can also check on that. For example, you would like to conduct a study on discourse analysis of how gender is represented in textbooks or gender is represented in various social media postings or news. Okay? John Stone in 1993 found that men and women construct different worlds of their stories via different plot types and different use of constructed dialogue and details. So you can actually have a gendered analysis of representations of world, for example, or how people share stories. There could be differences in terms of linguistic features and other non-linguistic elements. Quotes in 1996 showed that women have a tendency to tell self-deprecating narratives. And work on peer groups in schools also pointed to differences between girls and boys in storytelling style and content. I could say definitely there's a big difference between how male tell stories from females. Okay, so they're totally different because the approach, also the strategy, and even the discourse markers used totally different. And to formally end this video discussion, allow me to share to you the current state of the field. Now, we have known that there are two approaches that we can use in the analysis of narratives using discourse analysis. We could use interactional, which wherein you will have to focus on the interaction among characters or persona in the narratives, or you could also have structural, wherein you have to focus on the structural elements of the narrative, such as the build-up of story, the plot, the character, the setting, and the like. So speaking about all of these things, I think it's also primary that we know the current state of the field of analytics or analysis in the field of narratives. As scholars across disciplines have become more and more interested in narrative, the study of narrative has become more and more interdisciplinary, and the field is experiencing exponential growth. This is also highly evidenced in the different use of or in the use of different strategies in doing discourse analysis in the context of literary narratives. Okay, so that is why it's also important to study narratives using the lens of many fields, because you will have to understand the nature or the context of the narratives itself. For example, you should not focus on the words or the linguistic elements only. You should also consider that there could also be social or cultural background that has to be, reviewed in doing the discourse analysis. Much work is also presently devoted and will be very likely to continue to be devoted to studying how narratives are embedded within different kinds of practices, how they're shaped and how they shape those practices, and what kinds of new narrative genres emerge in them. So this is why it's very important that you also consider the different fields or disciplines used in analyzing narratives. You also have to look at the different kinds of practices embedded, or the different sets of culture or strings of beliefs embedded in these narratives, because they will also tell a lot, not only about the linguistic features, the choice of words, but also of the ideologies, the embedded themes that you can extract from these narratives. So that ends my discussion on discourse analysis and narratives. I hope that I was able to give you a light or understanding with regard to this field. And if you have questions, you may post them in the open forum. Thank you very much.